So the essence of this first meditation is the nature of God. Who is God? What is he? What is God essentially with respect to the created order? Now DBH is going to say exactly what we all classical Christians believe, namely that God has created the cosmos. He's created everything out of nothing, and so he wants us to take seriously God's creation out of nothing. So, in other words, if God created everything out of nothing, what sort of beliefs follow from that belief? DBH is going to say a lot of things follow from that belief. In fact, one thing, the important thing for him that follows from that belief is the subsequent belief that God will, in the end, save everybody. He will restore all of creation because he is creation's originator. He is creation's first cause. And as that first cause, all things will tend back toward him in the end. They have to. It's a necessity, right? So the substance of this argument happens on page 69 and following. And so I'm going to see if I can offer up uh, reasons why he thinks this, and somehow try to describe his thought processes on this. I admit, though, it's late and I'm exhausted and I'm tired. Had kind of a crazy day. So be that as it may, forgive me if I'm getting something wrong. DBH, if you're watching this, forgive me. I know you have only good thoughts toward me because in the end, I get to go to heaven with you. So anyway, although you might say I get extra time in purgatory or something. So anyway, forgive me. Let's go on. So nonetheless, since God is the creator of all things, and he created all things out of nothing, DBH says this, that, quote, since that's the case, quote, the moral destiny of creation and the moral nature of God are absolutely inseparable. So the moral nature of God as the absolute good and the moral destiny of all creation, those two things are so intimately tied together that if you want to believe that God is good, then you also, in his mind, have to believe that one day God will rectify and reconcile all things. And that's the destiny of all creation, because the morality of creation and the morality of God, the goodness of creation, the goodness of God, the fact of creation and the fact of God's goodness, those are so intimately tied together because God is nature's creator himself. Now, how does he get to that point? Well, he says that essentially because God is the creator out of nothing, then that means that no thing external to God forced God to create, and God is in no sense dependent on creation. Creation rather is dependent upon Him, and creation is created and sustained by God's being. That's what the doctrine of creation entails. That God is altogether non-dependent on creation, yet there's a link going the other way, that creation is linked up to God and dependent upon God's being and God's goodness, right? And if creation's tied to God like that, if it's so dependent on God's goodness and being, then it follows in DBH's mind that the creation itself must have a good end. So yeah, a couple other things, but we'll get to in a minute. But just to continue our thought here, he takes this further, page 69, middle of the page. He says, as the transcendent good beyond all beings, and that's a consequence of creation out of nothing, that God is the transcendent good beyond all beings. As such, God is also the transcendental end that makes every single action of any rational nature possible. Okay, so that's I agree with that. That God creates the possibility of every rational nature and decision or action from that nature. He goes on, moreover, the end toward which he acts must be his own goodness, for he is himself the beginning and end of all things. He says that this is not to deny, in addition to the primary causality of God's act of creation, that there are numerous forms of secondary causality operative within the creative order. So what he means is that even though God is the first cause, he admits there are also creatures within the created order who who make meaningful decisions, and they cause things to happen by their actions and decisions and so forth. And those are called secondary causes. So you have God as primary cause, and then you have these secondary causes. Um, without getting into too much detail here, these debates about primary causes, secondary causes, or these discussions, um, they're I don't know what to do with them, to be honest with you, for numerous reasons here. But anyway, that's for another conversation. He's just going to posit these sorts of things, and in a particular way, right? Again, lots of debates about how all this works, but nonetheless, we'll go with it. But he says, even though there are secondary causes, even though people like you and me make meaningful decisions and choices, and we cause certain things to happen, even though that's the case, none of these secondary causes can exceed or escape the one end toward which the first cause directs all things. So basically he's saying, look, even though people have freedom, even though people have significant freedom even, they're always, no matter what decision they make, their decision that they make will always, in the end, result in or tend toward reunion with the good, because God's the first cause, and he as final cause will be that end toward which all things move. And this is all driven by, again, the fact that God is first cause as creator. Okay, I hope all that makes sense. If it doesn't, blame me. I'm not maybe explaining it well enough at this late hour. He goes on to say, 69-70, that no matter how much autonomy that you give to creatures, he says that there are a couple things that are true regardless. Page 70, he says, the one thing that is true is that God's act of creation is free. It's absolutely free. It's constrained neither by necessity nor ignorance. All contingent ends are intentionally enfolded within his decision. So everything is enfolded within God's first decision of creation, and that's why everything is going to tend back to God. And secondly, because God is in himself absolute, that is to say, he is absolved from every other pathos of the contingent, so nothing's pushing him, nothing at all like that is affecting him of the sort. A finite substance does not have it says every effect of the sort that a finite substance has the power to visit upon another. I mean, he's free of all constraints, right? His moral venture in creating is infinite. So then he says, one way or another, and this is very important, one way or another, after all causes are logically reducible to their first cause. And he goes on later, he says, it does not matter whether one construes the relationship between primary and secondary causality as one of total determinism or of one of utter indeterminacy. For in either case, all consequents are contingent upon their primordial antecedent, apart from which they could not exist. Okay, there's a lot here. Maybe I shouldn't even read that section here, but it's important, I think. So again, remember how I said that there's lots of debates about the relationship between primary causes and secondary causes. What is that relationship about? He says it doesn't matter. I mean, it really doesn't matter at all. He said if your primary cause, which is God, and your secondary causes, which are like people like you and me, even if it's total like puppeteering, like God's determining everything that we do, and we're not really free, then that would guarantee that God would get his way in the end, namely a reunification with us, right? Because why? God's determining everything, right? But even if there is no determining going on from God's perspective down on us, even if that were the case, he says, it doesn't matter, according to him. We would all still result in the end with being reconciled back to God. That would be our end result, simply because of the nature of how God is the first cause, and God is the end toward which all things come. That's just the definition of what God is, right? Yeah, so lots more to say here, but essentially that's his argument. God is creator of all things. As a result, all things will tend back to him because he is the first cause. So again here, it's important to remember the whole scheme of DBH's thought. Remember how he said on page 69 that the moral destiny of creation and the moral nature of God are absolutely inseparable. So that's why he thinks you can't ever have a part of creation that isn't reconciled back to God in the end. Because if you even believe that, then you'd also have to believe that that God's not really good, because again, all creation receives its being from the one God, and And so if there ever was anything at the end of time that was perpetually left in rebellion against God, then what that might entail is, well, that God is the cause of that. That God is somehow the cause of that mode of being. And to DBH, that doesn't make sense. And again, he talks a little bit about that on at the end of page 70, and I'm in the end of page 71 and 72. At any rate, that captures essentially his thought that because God is creator, and because of the relationship that creation has with God, a dependent one, there's just really no way for creation to be completely and finally separated from God. Unless, of course, you want to say that God wants it that way, which is nonsense, right? This is his main thesis. If God is creator of all things out of nothing, then in his mind, given the inseparable relationship between nature and God, it just simply follows that everything has to come back to God in the end. One initial rebuttal I might have at this point is to simply say, well, look, it seems like DBH, even though his system is pretty nice and tidy, it seems, right? Though I don't think so, but it seems on the surface nice and tidy and compact and everything. And B follows A and C follows B and so forth. It seems though that he might have a problem here, right? If everything what he says is correct, and so forth, then it seems he might have a problem in answering the question of why is there evil now? In the present time, there is evil, right? Turn on CNN, turn on Fox News. I mean, you'll notice there is evil in the world, right? Turn on the nightly news. It's easily provable. So if there's evil right now in the present world, why is God permitting that? It seems like he might have a good reason to permit that. And as DBH will say elsewhere, I mean, he believes in some sort of conception of autonomy and freedom. So my thought is, why is it the case that we can have a bit of the creation right now that is in rebellion against God, that is not reconciled to God at the moment, and that in and of itself is permissible within DBH's own system, but why couldn't that also be true of every subsequent present moment that a person might have? So what I mean is, if right now there's a person, call this person sinner. If sinner is having a present moment of rebellion against God due to their choice in some sense, then and if it's the case that God is permitting that for whatever reason, and it clearly is the case that he is, right? Well, it's not incoherent to think that God would permit that same person to have in their next moment the same rebellious attitude. So, in other words, if they're having a present experience or a present moment of rebellion against God at 10 o'clock, then maybe there's nothing incoherent about God allowing them, due to their own free will or whatever, to have that same present moment of rebellion against him at 10:01 and then at 10:02 and at 10:03. Well, suppose that this goes on for, I don't know, eternity. It seems to me, in other words, that maybe, and again, it's late, so I'm thinking through these things. It seems to me that DBH may have a problem under his view of making sense of current evil. I mean, he doesn't want there to be an everlasting hell, an eternal hell, because that would mean that there was a continual evil, continual rebellion against God for all eternity. Well, again, I don't want to rehash all this, but if there can be rebellion against God in a present moment, then maybe there could be rebellion against God in every subsequent moment that a person experiences, or in other words, for all eternity. And like him, he's going to say that the reason a person's in rebellion against God now is because of freedom. Well, maybe freedom is a good hypothesis and a good defense for why there could be an eternal hell. Again, I recall C.S. Lewis and most people who defend the position of an eternal hell or some sort of hell like that will do so on the grounds of creaturely freedom. I think it makes sense. I think it works, and you still get this idea of course, of God being supremely good and so forth and so on. And I know that DBH is going to push back against that. At the end of the day, though, I just don't think you can dispense with creaturely freedom the way that he wants to. Okay, much more to say about that when we get to that meditation.